Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. When we think about quote-unquote regional history or stories, it may seem peculiar to look outward towards the international or transnational for understanding. But any careful study of the American West shows how thoroughly the region's recent past and present were shaped by global forces. The region was one of global contest, and even events that seem unique to the region were often mirrored by like events in other colonial settings. This month we speak with Dr. Janne Lahti about his 2019 book, The American West and the World, Transnational and Comparative Perspectives. His work is an excellent reminder that we should view international peoples, connections, and stories as central to the West, rather than as exotic, accidental, or anomalous. I'll introduce Dr. Lahti a bit more in a moment, but first, some housekeeping. For new listeners, let me take a quick moment to explain a bit about the podcast. Each episode features a conversation with authors, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, academics, or others who write about the North American West. Our goal is not only showcase their work, but to spark curiosity among you, the listeners, to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the people who call it home. If a writer intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please do subscribe, share links with friends, leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using to listen. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and send in some feedback. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and an Associate Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation, with me playing the roles of host, producer, sound engineer, and just about everything else, all of which entail tasks for which I have very little training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and all the work is well worth the excuse to read more and to talk to interesting people. At the end of this episode, I will include some more information on me and my scholarship, and on the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. With all this business out of the way, let's move on to today's conversation. First, I'd like to introduce to you who it is we're talking to and why. Dr. Janne Lahti teaches history at the University of Helsinki, is an Academy of Finland Research Fellow, and the editor of the journal American Studies in Scandinavia. He's the author of multiple books and articles, most notably the recent monographs Cinematic Settlers, The Settler Colonial World in Film, and Wars for Empire, Apaches, the United States, and the Southwest Borderlands. Today we talk about his 2019 book, The American West and the World, Transnational and Comparative Perspectives. Rather than a project based in new archival work, this text is a useful synthetic overview of a variety of topics and drawing from a robust literature of recent scholarship. By offering a bird's-eye view of the ways in which the American West can be viewed through its transnational connections or comparative perspectives, Lahti asks us to take nearly every conceivable Western story we know and consider how it likely fits into global contexts that we often overlook. Viewing Western histories as unfolding in tight connection with global worlds promises new understandings of the past, and perhaps more importantly, better understandings of our present globalized Western lives. Dr. Janne Lahti, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Brendan. It's a great pleasure to be here, talking to you from another continent, from Helsinki, Finland.
Great to be here, meaning on the other side of the world, but it's great that we can meet virtually and chat, isn't it? I actually wanted to talk a little bit about Finland, and for people who've been following scholarship in the American West may have noted that there is an interesting cluster of scholars in Finland working on the North American West and on indigenous peoples. Can you give us a little background? What's the genesis of this Finnish fascination and scholarly expertise about the American West?
Actually, yeah, you're right. There are several of us already, and I think that one of my books was reviewed in Western History Quarterly, but almost a decade ago. And I can't remember the reviewer, but he or she stated that there's this Helsinki School for American West. There seems to be this kind of phenomenon going on. Obviously, most of us are students of Markku Henriksson, who's now retired, but has pioneered a great career in American studies, and has also had special interest in the American West. But there are several. Pekka Hämäläinen is probably the most famous professor in Oxford these days. Rani Andersson here in Helsinki with me. We actually work quite a lot together these days. Sami Lakomäki in Oulu in the north, another great scholar, and there's several of us like you said. Of course, Henriksson is the scholarly influence basically behind all of us. But of course, I don't know if there's of course there's this general fascination with the Wild West that I at least have as a child, and of course in hindsight as a middle-aged man now, you can easily exaggerate those kind of influences, but you can actually also see those influences that as a kid you are fascinated with the American West, and it somehow grew into a profession, which is odd, but still.
Was the American West of your childhood similar to that of, I've talked to people from Germany where, Western movies, American and Italian and German-made Western movies were a big part of their childhood. Was it similar in Finland?
It was similar in Finland in some ways, at least. I believe that it was most popular a generation before me in the 60s. And when I was a young kid growing up in the 80s, I was kind of an oddball already, because computer games have replaced playing Cowboys and Indians, but I was still playing Cowboys and Indians. I had all these miniature figures and all these toys, but the Western movies were also kind of not that popular anymore. Of course, Clint Eastwood was popular, but still, I was very fascinated by these older Westerns, Randall Scott, John Wayne, Jim Stewart. Those were kind of a big influence as growing up. There was also, of course, in the 80s, there were 2 TV channels, so the range was limited. But there was this tradition on one of those channels of having a monthly Western, every month an old classic Western, and that's one of the first actual memories I have of watching those with my parents, and I think it was the first image I have is Randall Scott's Ride Lonesome movie, if you know that. But in the 80s, it was fading. The Western popularity was fading. But I have a couple of friends who are 15 or so years older than I am, and we've been discussing that. They told me that when they were kids, everybody was playing Cowboys and Indians. Everybody was always reading these Western comics. I was also reading Western comics. Lucky Luke, Tex Willer. I only realized as an adult that they were actually European-made comics, that they were not American comics at all. I know, but hardly anybody knew in the US knew about these comics, but they were very popular, and they're still very popular in Europe. They're still, Tex Willer, for example, Blueberry, also one of those series, and Lucky Luke, Tex Willer and Lucky Luke, there's constant new albums coming. And then, of course, Tex Willer is from Italy, and Lucky Luke is from France. But as a kid, they were a big thing, and collected those albums. And actually, at some point in my 20s, I sold the albums, but now I'm recollecting them again. So.
Well, I think it's interesting and somewhat counterintuitive for a lot of people to consider that, that there are foreigners studying our region here in the American West, but you bring with it a very different outside perspective. But some people, in terms of actually thinking about history and foreign connections, may find it counterintuitive to look at Western regional history and how it was shaped by connections to outside the region. Even though the more you look, the more you realize that Western history has been constantly driven by outside factors and by transnational and international connections. And this is actually an idea that we haven't dealt with much on the podcast, kind of the international and transnational world into which the American West developed. So I'm happy we can do a little bit about that today. Beyond kind of the first initial moments of European exploration of the American West, right? We have all these really well-known narratives of European explorers. I think that's when a lot of people stop thinking about international things in the American West after it was initially explored, right? Why do you think that is? Why is it that people, or at least Americans, forget all of the international, transnational contexts so early in our regional
I think
history?
it's a very common trait also here in Europe. Uh, uh, of course, there are probably several explanations, but one of the things has to do with the development of kind of the nation state as the framing idea of history. That everything needs that we are Finns, those are Swedes, and those are Russians, and we are all very different. Well, of course, we are not very different, but that idea that that history is compartmentalized into these nation state paradigms, the nation state boxes. It's for if you think about Finnish history, we have a lot of interactions with the Scandinavian neighbors, with our neighbors to the east, Russia and beyond, and also to Germany and Central Europe. But still, the kind of history I was taught at school in the 90s was that Finland was the logical result, the end result of history, the kind of a culmination point. And Finnish independence was gained from Russia, but it was not emphasized that it was gained within this context of the great revolutions of World War One and the kind of all the activity going on, and we actually chose a German king for ourselves during World War One, and then of course it all fell apart in a couple of months. But all these connections were kind of hidden, and also when Finland changed hands from Sweden in 1809 to Russia, it was taught within this context. Nobody told that Napoleon actually was the great instigator of that exchange, and all these kind of connections are hidden when you have to and try to emphasize this nation state as the prime mover of history, the essential unit of history. And of course, this book is an attempt to kind of go against that, take another different type of look. In the U.S. West, the explorations, the idea that U.S. West was international before it was national, of course, put the emphasis on these explorations and all those. But when you think about Lewis and Clark, the usual story of Lewis and Clark pioneering the trail to the Pacific was full of activity. There were indigenous peoples, there were Hawaiians there were the Russians were there, the British were there, the French were there. I think by the time the Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific Ocean, there was several different, even smaller states from Europe. City states like Hamburg had ships on the Pacific coastline, and so it was teeming with activity, trade that linked the American West through the Pacific to China and beyond to the British East India Company, and then to all the British Empire. But of course, to the interior of North American West, and then fur trade, for example, linking to the Europe and all these European empires already spreading across the world. So it was very international all along. So it was this tendency and this habit we have of thinking through the nation state, which I personally think we should try to question and try to get rid of. But of course, that's easier said than done.
Well, I think in America, especially, the West has really become a core part of our national creation myth, right? And this idea of what made Americans American, it was all wrapped up in the West, and that comes out in the Western films and movies that you and grew up on, others, but it was all wrapped up in explaining who we are and the validity of our claims to these lands and so forth. But I do think that's funny. So Lewis and Clark show up like in 1805 or whenever it was. And the native, the Chinooks and native peoples there, they weren't like, oh my goodness, who are you? Like white people, we never seen this before. But they've been interacting with Europeans for over 100 years. You talk about what you call the Great Pacific Rendezvous. this intersection of so many different European empires, and as you say, even city-states up in the Pacific Northwest, which is where I'm from. So I like reading about these international stories about kind of my home region. But can you paint the picture for us a little bit of the 16th century international world and competition that was happening in the Pacific Northwest, that northern coast, Vancouver Island? Who all was there and what were they engaged in?
Well, there, as actually, like you mentioned, there were several different European empires engaged, and for example, the Russians were coming down from Alaska. They were usually connect the Russians only with Alaska when you talk about North America, and you will usually only emphasize that they were there for trading, that they were killing different types of animals, perhaps some missionary work in Alaska as well. But take for example Fort Ross which is less than 100 miles north of San Francisco. It was a trading post, Russian trading post, started in the early 1800s, but it was also imagined in St. Petersburg, at least in certain circles, that it would be the starting point of Russian settler colonization in North America. Of course, the Spaniards they have been in the U.S. Southwest for centuries already, in New Mexico, but their expansion also on the California coastline, the missionary system was spreading northward, and they made claims on the Pacific Northwest coast.
And that's why if you look up there, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Fidalgo Island, Lopez Island, I mean, that's all Spanish names in the San Juan Islands. And as a kid, I was like, why are these Spanish names up here in the Pacific Northwest, right? But there's this overlapping far northern Spanish claim. My students are always blown away when I'm like, how far south did the Russians claim? And they're like, the Inside Passage of Alaska. And I'm like, no, Northern California. No one knows about Fort Ross, right? But there are these wild kind of overlapping.
And there's a lot of overlapping. And they had these diplomatic disputes on who gets to fish or trade with the natives on what different locations. And of course, the British were there. Probably the most famous British explorer ever, James Cook, was there, also looking for the Northwest Passage. That's, of course, one of the things that draws, also besides the trade, the idea of Northwest Passage is a kind of a European obsession. From very early on, when the first Spaniards get to California, they think that China is just right there. It's reachable. Even later on, when the Spanish galleons cross the Pacific, and they realize that it's China is pretty far away. Still, this myth persists that there's this. That there could be this closeness, that there could be these passages we can exploit. And the Northwest Passage, of course, with the climate change these days, it's now open in the summers, in my understanding, at least for a short while, which is terrifying. But for the environment, but still in the 1700s, 1800s, Europeans were obsessed with finding these shortcuts and these routes, and that kind of brings all the potential players. But of course, it was a global. It was kind of global game. When we talk about globalization these days, we usually think about the recent past. And early on in the modern exploration, we had these trade companies: the British East India Company, Hudson's Bay Company. They even had a Russian Alaskan company. The Swedes also had a Caribbean company or something like that. But they were basically global players engaged in different kinds of trade. Slavery was, of course, essential part of that as well. But not only African slavery, but also other forms of slavery and different kinds of connections. And it became later on, especially, it became in Europe. This kind of idea that if you want to be a big, significant nation of significant people, you needed to have an empire. You needed to play globally. And it applied also to smaller states later on, the Polish and the Finns as well. We had all sorts of different, very weird and fantastic dreams of conquering space, and in not only in our neighboring areas, but in Africa as well, and all sorts of crazy plans.
Yeah, so we have a couple early centuries in the American West where it's the playground, yeah, for global empire. But Americans look at the region, and since it became America, we read backwards onto it the idea that it was always destined to be American, or that somehow it was always inherently American, but it was not. And also, if you look at, especially when we expanded out into that maritime world along the Pacific coast, you look at who the crewmen were on these different ships, and Spanish ships weren't just all a bunch of Spaniards working the ship. The ships are all these just wildly international crews that are operating in this whole Pacific, well, and Atlantic worlds. So again, the making the coast even more international than we may
That's
otherwise
true, and
think.
it also applies to the interior posts as well. With the Hudson's Bay Company, was a couple of years ago. The WHA was in Portland. We visited Fort Vancouver, and just realized that the Fort Vancouver, the personnel there was basically from all over the world. It was most nations of Europe were represented, and there were different types of people from different Pacific islands. Asians were there, Native Americans were there as well, and not only local Native Americans, but from New England, for example. And so it was very. It's very fascinating to see that these people had these connections and these global lives, because, like I said, you grew up with these nation-state histories, but then later on, as a professional historian, you start to realize that these connections are endless. That these are so large and so complicated that, at least for me, they are very fascinating, and for, at least my students are usually surprised by these connections.
Yeah.
And
we have this idea that globalization and complex international relations are only occurred in the modern era, but not the case. Not the case at all.
Yeah.
Well, as we move more towards the interior, you also bring in that of kind of more traditional Great Plains, an interior West agricultural settlement, and the different types of settlers that come and settle the American interior, which again, for many Americans, they view kind of the agricultural pioneer imagery as these are the most prototypical Americans, the most American of Americans, right? Salt of the earth, getting their hands in the dirt Americans. And if you've spent I spent, about a decade on the Great Plains, and all over the Great Plains, there's Swedish towns and Czech towns and German towns. And you go farther up under the Canadian prairies, and there's Ukrainian and Russian and Germans from Russia. And once we say get into the mid 1800s, even the interior of the country and those that are peopling it are wildly international. What are some of the more compelling stories you think of these international settlers who come to the American interior and populate the American West?
I think one of the things that to try to make clear in the book, that the American West was just part of this settler revolutions. That it was more transnational, trans-imperial, whatever term you want to use, global phenomenon that brought these different peoples, and in many places the Europeans were the majority, but also in many places, for example, people came and went. There were these migrant families who located, for example, in Nebraska, then moved to Dakotas, and then to Canada, and then back to Nebraska. And they all used these networks. They went back home, for example, to Finland or Norway or Germany, recruit their neighbors there, and then lived with those old neighbors in the New World. There's one story, and I just need to check the figures from the book actually, about how these kind of farming migrations, settler migrations, were also part of this marketing boosterism, which had global dimensions as well. There were hundreds of people working to find new settlers from Europe, not only from American companies or states, but also from Canada, from New Zealand. They were printing these thousands of leaflets. They were having these public tours in Europe. They were sending speakers to Europe to do all this recruitment, and there's a lot of these different types of connections going on. And the book mentions that there's this one speaker working for the Southern Pacific Railroad, who was basically touring in the UK mostly. He was giving his regular presentation, Wonders of the Western Country. And by the time he retired, he had given that same speech 3,357 times, reaching 1.5 million people, an estimate, of course, but still, by speaking, lecturing, recruiting people to come to the US West. But it's very important also to realize that not all were welcome. And that was also a transnational, trans-imperial phenomenon. We all know about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but also other empires, the British in South Africa or Australians, they were in dialogue with each other. They were enabling similar types of legislation that kept certain people out, and they were copying those legislations. They were using examples. One of the popular examples that these people who wanted to exclude the Asians from the American West used was the British Natal in South, the province in South Africa, and they saw that in Natal, where the British had brought in Indian and Chinese laborers, and they had become a minority basically there. They had outnumbered the whites, which was a crucial point. And it was used as an example of how you need to have this title legislation. The Chinese were, of course, the prime target at the time, and this kind of idea that there was also this. And these were not only extremist ideas, but this idea that there would be a royal war between the Chinese and the whites, this kind of global racial war. And it was even taught at West Point at some time that they were kind of serious military thinkers, or at least they portrayed to be that. Well, of course, this idea that there would be this great racial war. But also, if you think about the Chinese migration, American West was just one of those many places where the Chinese went. The Chinese migration, which is in numbers, is in tens of millions, like the European migration. Most Chinese went to their own frontiers, their own American West in Jiangning or in Manchuria, and most went there, conquering areas and competing with the Russians in Manchuria over these areas. And other Chinese, millions of Chinese went all across Southeast Asia, which is also something, at least for me, these are they're not new things, but they're fascinating things. And last winter, I taught a course at the Free University Berlin on global settler colonialism, and my student body was very cool. Actually, for once, but truly global. We had from all the continents basically students there. Some of them were from Malaysia. And they made a presentation on Chinese settler colonialism in Malaysia. And it was very poignant, this idea that the Chinese came and made themselves this upper class, and that Chinese settler colonialism was still an ongoing thing in Malaysia, that they had not recognized. One of the students was from Taiwan, which also had these similar dimensions, that the indigenous Taiwanese are suppressed still, and they had not been recognized. And so all these kind of stuff that happens in the American West happens elsewhere, and it's connected to these different places. I'm getting too excited almost now.
But it's not unique to the American West. We have all these ideas of American exceptionalism, and we think, oh, these poor European farmers needed some place to go, and so they all came to the American West. But some came to the American West, but some also went to Australia, and some went to South Africa, some went to South America, right? So the things that happen in the American West are happening globally, and that's interesting that even immigration policies like Chinese exclusion, Americans aren't coming up with these ideas in a vacuum. They're in conversation and dialogue with other global policies that other empires are taking on.
Right. If you think about different immigrant groups, what I've been mostly interested lately is the German colonialism as a global phenomenon as well. If you think of that, the Germans are the biggest single white ethnic group in the American West, and in certain locations you can still easily see it, like in Nebraska, where I spent a year and a half as a Fulbright at the UNL, and whenever you read the local paper, there was this marriage section. There was Schultz and Schmitz right there still, but still you can find the Schmitz and Schultz in southern Brazil, in Argentina, and you can still find them there. And it was also ironic that the German Empire, the Kaiserreich, conquered what is today Namibia, the German Southwest Africa, for the purpose of that it would become a new Germany. But nobody wanted to go there. Everybody wanted to go to the North America or South America for the most part. And this but there was the motivation for German colonial conquest in what was German Southwest Africa was that it would attract these German settlers who were now moving to areas of other empires. Mm-hmm. So one type of connection there as well.
My students were always surprised when I taught in Nebraska to learn about that real the international flavor of agricultural settlement there in the region. And we would then walk through, the World War I and World War II eras in the United States. And it was no longer fashionable to be proudly ethnically German during World War I or during World War II. So we have this really rich ethnic diversity on the plains and other places in the United States that is very suppressed during the World Wars. And many in these communities intentionally trying to prove their Americanness by downplaying their Germanness, right? I don't remember if it was in World War I or World War II, but there's this one town in Nebraska. I want to say it was Garland, Nebraska, maybe. But the town's original name was like Germantown or something like that. And so the town said, hey, we need to rename our town. How about we'll rename it after the first one of our residents who is killed in action in the war, and we'll name it in their honor. Well, of course, the first person killed, the last name was Schultz or something, like a very German-sounding name. And they're like, okay, well, maybe the second person. And I think it was Garland. I think that's the one. Right. And
one of the things that wonders me is why Bismarck is still existent in North Dakota. How come that name never changed? But of course, there are these German connections, and World War One, when of course the U.S. and Germans are on opposite sides for the first time. There is this. If the people change their last names, German newspapers are beginning to fade away. One of the things I mentioned in the book is San Antonio, which usually, at least I don't usually connect to Germanness, although I realized that there was a lot of Germans in Texas at one point, and there still are. But this San Antonio, there's this stories that in the late 1800s, before World War One, the common parlance, common talk in town that was German. That the Mexicans knew how to converse in German, but eventually, of course, that died down very quickly. And both World War Wars, of course, are to blame. But there are these German connections. Of course, Dwight Eisenhower was Eisenhower. He is of German descent. But there are one of the things when I was in Nebraska, it's almost 20 years ago when I was in Nebraska. Still remember this. We were talking with my wife and kids, Finnish in the local grocery store, and one of the older lady came up. Are you talking German? I said, no, we are from Finland. We are from. Then she started to explain how her grandparents came from Germany, but how her father forbid anybody in the family of reading or talking in German when she was a kid. So she didn't, and she was very in her 80s or 90s already. So that was kind of
This is a common story. Like there are a lot of American families who have this exact same story. One thing I really liked about your book is that it addresses a lot of Western tropes, stereotypes about the West, and then shows how they're really actually more international in context than we think. And one of the most striking, if you grew up on Western movies or dime novels or things, is the idea of the West as a place of violence. And you recast the violent West as often violence occurring on frontiers and borders, and violence on the edges of empire, which be it competing Euro-American empires, or a violence across the frontiers and borders with indigenous peoples, or indigenous peoples crossing imposed Euro-American borders. What is it about a borderland region or a frontier, or where empires meet, that amplifies violence, or that encourages it, or that focuses it on these certain regions?
Of course, it depends on the players, on the time and place. There's what the aims are. But of course, if you think about the settler colonial expansions, the settler colonialism it doesn't tolerate competition. So you need to have total control of that area. You need to and the idea is to replace those already there. So you need to eliminate them in one way or another. Of course, elimination doesn't necessarily mean physical violence, but often those who resist, those who are military powerful, indigenous communities already there, independent indigenous communities, they easily create clashes. But also, if you think about borderlands more broadly, it's offers spaces for different types of players, indigenous and non-indigenous, to take benefit of their neighbors, to raid, to try to exploit. Been studying the Apaches quite a bit, and in certain Apache communities, not all, but what you usually call the Chiricahua Apaches, and what you usually see as these common Apache types. The idea that those who had transgressed their borders, whether it be the Othams or the Mexicans or the Americans or whoever, they kind of owed the Apaches something as a payment. And if they were not willing to give the payment easily, there was this logic that you could raid them and you can just make them pay for passage or mining rights or whatever was happening on your lands. Of course, one of the things I want to emphasize in this book also is the indigenous participation. That is, of course, there's not a lot, but there's talk about the Comanche Empire there, and these Lakota expansions, the Apaches as borderlands raiders, also Makah meeting in the Pacific Rendezvous, and that the indigenous peoples are active participants in all these things going on, and they are not victims as a rule, but they are part of the mix, and there's individuals making different choices and different types of communities. But of course, the violence, I draw a lot of connections to Southern Africa, for example, using James Camp's great book, Dust Rose Like Smoke, which is one of the things I read when I was at UNL. John Wanderer made me read it. And so
made me read it too.
between the Lakotas and the Zulus and the British Empire and the U.S. Empire in the plains, one of those connections. But there's also different types of explorations we can still do, and that's one of the ideas of this book is as a synthesis that it would kind of entice new scholarship, that it would open. Make visible certain possibilities that you can compare.
What are some of the other ripe comparisons that you think that you want to see, like the next books on? Like, what's your list?
What I'm working on right now is comparing the U.S. conquest of the Southwest with the German conquest of Southwest Africa. For example, trying to see connections in violence is one of those, but also more broadly in colonial empire building. But if you talk about violence, German officials sent representatives from Southwest Africa, for example, to Arizona to look at the San Carlos Indian Reservation and see how things are done in the early 1900s in the U.S. Southwest, and then try to implement those learnings against the Herero and Nama peoples in Southwest Africa. But what I argue is that the Germans took that violence they so admired and wanted to copy from the American West. They took it one step beyond. They made it so systematic that the systematic genocide or state-led genocide. If you think about the American West, there are genocidal events, moments, whatever you want to call them, but usually they are not always. Usually they are the results of settlers not the federal government. The federal government did not have policy to exterminate all Cheyennes or all Chiricahuas. Civil War volunteers are a different case. But in Southwest Africa, the federal, the German government, the Reich, implemented these genocidal, violent measures, and they did it against the opposition of local settlers who wanted to use the indigenous peoples as labor force. But still, the government had this notion that we will destroy these hereros and namas once and for all, and then ethnic Germans can come and settle these areas. So, but there's tons of different kind of connections. Also, you can draw from French Algeria, which also had this kind of similarities to U.S. Southwest, especially of settler colonialism, penetrating mostly a desert region and trying to conquer and exploit that. And of course, in the U.S. Southwest, settler colonialism, whites became the majority. In French Algeria, although there were 1 million whites by World War II, they were always the minority there. And after World War II, like we know, settler colonialism in French Algeria was overturned. And that's one of the things you usually think about settler colonialism as this permanent, ongoing. And it's certainly true in North America, Australia, New Zealand, but also settler colonialism can be overturned, like in French Algeria. South Africa, German Southwest Africa, also some of the examples. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are no colonial legacies, that land rights, for example, land owning doesn't reflect those old colonial legacies. But in theory, settler colonial powers can be defeated. And of course, in American West, that kind of the whole idea is very, complicated.
These global examples offer alternative possibilities of how things in the American West could have played out, right? There are post-colonial worlds elsewhere where settler colonialism was overturned, right? And it wasn't a foregone conclusion necessarily that it would not be that here as well. But again, I like how this contextualizing of things that we view in the American West is very unique. Not only did the violence happen elsewhere, but often the colonial violence elsewhere was being explicitly patterned after what was being done in the American West, and vice versa. So there's these global conversations of empires looking to each other, looking to the American West, and exporting ideas, importing ideas. There's this global conversation.
And one of the things that interests me these days is finding people who are actually involved in different armies, different types of colonial campaigns of violence, and I managed to locate a couple of officers from the U.S. Southwest who were, example, in the wars in South Africa and elsewhere, and also the use of indigenous soldiers is one of the things that we usually call the Indian Scouts in the American West. But also one of these patterns that people from abroad, from the British Empire, for example, came to the U.S. West to look at, and vice versa also. And they used the U.S. Indian Scouts as a model, for example, later in Kenya. And there's also all different types of example of going on. One of the things that also fascinates, that kind of humors me, is this, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte was having trouble in Haiti, and because of the Haiti troubles, he gave up Louisiana. And instead of building a continental empire in North America, he wanted to build a continental empire in Europe, and for a couple of years was doing great at it, but eventually was not successful. But he had these ideas of that the whole Europe should become like a French settler colonial empire, which is, in hindsight, sounds absolutely ridiculous. But it just different connections are endless. That's basically.
You do a chapter you call Intimacies of Empire, and one of the more compelling things I found in terms of the direct comparative examples is these ideas about interracial unions, mixed race populations, and how different empires, including what happened in the American West, regulate race and construct ideas of race, who belongs, who does not, what kinds of interracial unions are permissible, which ones are not, what the consequences of them are. How does the the formation of race in the American West compare with the things we see in these other colonial empires elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of similar types of connections we talked about with the Exclusion Acts, the immigration. Once more, people are in conversation with each other over imperial borders. There's this kind of shared ideas of what Victorian era middle class culture contains, who is white and who is not. But of course, there's a lot of differences. But also in American West, before the U.S. settler takeover, there was a lot of racial mixing. Think about the fur trade, for example. A lot of these interracial unions and some of them were very high status people who were doing it for the Hudson Bay Company, and they sent their mixed race kids to these world class schools in London or Montreal or whatever. And the same was happening in European empires. When with Dutch East Indies, the Dutch men were having interracial unions with local women, and often it was perfectly acceptable in the mid 1800s still. And some of these, most of these kids were seen as white. They were sent to Amsterdam or wherever in Europe for schooling. Like it was a common thing to do with the upper classes or middle classes. But at some point in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with the Exclusion Acts, with the rise of these settler revolutions, this rise of the settler colonial world, racial lines became much harder. There was much more tighter definitions of who was white, and while in the past it was easy to claim whiteness by acting like one, by behaving, by associating with other whites. It was not necessarily important of what skin color you had, but how you behaved, how you were educated, how you lived, how you even dressed, for example. And that kind of continued, but there was this legislation banning interracial unions. In the American West, we have these, and there's different types of bans. White, black were usually more strict than white Native American bans. But there's also similar things happening in the Dutch East Indies, for example. That the offspring of interracial unions were no longer considered as Dutch or white. There was even plans of resettling these mixed race people in Papua New Guinea, establishing a kind of this colony of mixed race Dutch settler colony that never happened actually. But also in German Southwest Africa, where Germans have been coming in small numbers, but still from the 1880s onward. It was in 1905 or 6, well, anyway, 1905 or 1906, that this new legislation banned interracial marriages, and it applied to all those marriages already in existence. So you can have these kids of children born from mixed race unions who were, say, whatever their age was in 1905, they lost their German citizenship overnight. They were no longer considered German, and they were as such, they were no longer considered white.
So was the hardening of racial lines, say, in German Africa, more severe than in places in the American West?
I think it was once more the idea was that it should become a new Germany, that you needed kind of this pure ethnic white Germans in there, that mixed race unions were a terrible thing. And I think that but the similar type of ideas are in the American West as well in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they are also in South Africa, of course. And not sure if they're only in settler colonies, because Dutch East Indies it's not a settler colony. And they also have these kind of tighter legislations. White Australia policy comes in, it's 1901 or something like that, which basically bans anybody else who is not identified as white from entering Australia. And of course, who is white?
That's changing as
Irish
well.
were not white in the 1820s. The Finns were not white at some point. We were Mongols or Asians in North American discourse. And of course, racial sciences are a big thing at that time. And there's these definitions and who qualifies as white. And it's a very fascinating phenomenon, because it happens in these different. Of course, it happens in unevenly, and the connections are multiple. but there are connections and there are things happening in different parts of the world.
Is there kind of a commonality of at the early stages of empire and settler colonial or other forms of empire, these intimate mixings are more permissible. Often they're actually a necessity, and in some cases they're encouraged as a way to get a foothold, right? Yeah. But then once the peripheries start to be then pulled into tighter control of the empire, or as the settler, expansion starts to bring more white people out to the frontier, those interracial unions become less and less permissible. But so do you see a commonality across the world of a general pattern there?
There's definitely a commonality, and of course it has to do with the number of white women in these colonies, and the idea of can we have white women in these colonies, because previously take for example the Dutch East Indies and German Southwest Africa as examples once more. Women were forbidden from settling there. It was seen as too dangerous, too hostile, that they would not make it in the environment, that the natives would be a danger to these white women. But at some point the idea started to change, and it was encouraged that white women should be allowed to travel. It was actually, there was these organizations who paid for the travel, who recruited white women in Germany, for example, to become housewives in Southwest Africa, and perhaps the Germans once more took it to the next level, because in Southwest Africa it was not a good thing to have even native servants. You needed even the servants needed to be German, because it was seen that the native servants would contaminate the family, would contaminate the kids, and also seduce the husband. Basically, in German thinking, the husband was the weakest link in the whole thing.
Yeah, and I know in other places, white women were actively recruited to in missionary efforts and education efforts, but they at some point were then viewed as, well, maybe they will be the bearers of civilization that will bring proper society and civilization, out to these savage frontiers. But there's a real gendered aspect to these racial relations. I was just talking yesterday with some people about Andres Resendez's book, The Other Slavery, where he's talking about indigenous slavery in the Americas. And he brings up the point that at various moments in New Spain, that the prices of indigenous slaves, that indigenous women were priced higher than indigenous men as slaves. But it was not the case at the same time and place with African slaves. So people felt it was okay to be intermarrying with or having children with indigenous women, but not with enslaved African women, right? And so there's a gendered aspect to many of these things, but it's applied unevenly to different races by these colonial empires.
And one of the things, of course, explaining why Asian women were banned is, of course, that the Asian man would not reproduce offspring, but also that the Asian women would not seduce white men. The Asian women were seen as perhaps the most dangerous of all. But of course, the mission of the white women is as civilizing influence is also a global phenomenon. Like, take for example Margaret Jacobs' excellent book, where she makes a great case for this maternal colonialism in American West and in Australia, that had this civilizing mission of re-educating the indigenous youth, and make the indigenous youth as this kind of clones of whites, if you want to call it that way, but basically cut away their Indianness or aboriginality, and make them. Of course, the women's role is fascinating in many levels as well, because at least once more in German Southwest Africa, German women became the hardest advocates for racial boundaries, which is quite. It's one of the things I'm doing work on right now, and some of the texts are astonishing, even for a historian who has been working on colonialism for a decade or more. It's still shocking.
You still find shocking
things. We read a lot about the U.S. settler women in Arizona, and they, of course, they had middle class women. They had this certain attitude towards the Apaches, but it usually mixes contempt with curiosity. But in German Southwest Africa, it's just contempt. with hatred and advocacy for violence. Of course, not everybody, but there are several of those diaries.
I mean, if you read some of the accounts of the wives, in southern plantations in the American South, and I mean, there are mixed race children running around the plantation as visible proof of their husband's infidelity, right? And so it's maybe no wonder that, say, German women in South Africa were the ones advocating for racial purity, because the evidence of mixed race children are evidence that their men are not being faithful.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And I also think about, I mean, we could go on and on about this, but there's such a wealth of new works coming out with these comparative angles. And the American, I mean, I have a number of books with comparing the American West with Australia. I'm thinking of Anne McGrath's recent book, Illicit Love, Margaret Jacobs'
Kat
books.
Ellinghaus also.
There's Kat Ellinghaus is a new one. Yeah. Claudia Haig. I mean, there's so much comparative work being done, and a lot of it, because you do have two kind of Anglo colonial projects, right, in North America or Canada, that you can then bounce off of another Anglo colonial project in Australia. It makes for a really fertile comparative ground. So I recommend readers to go do some digging, because the first real comparative work I think I was exposed to was Gumps, comparing Lakotas and Zulu, right? And I found that really interesting. And since then, or Steve Sable wrote this book about American policies with Lakotas compared to Russian policies with Kazakhs. There's so much great comparative work being done. We need to start wrapping up, but your final chapter, you close your book talking about how foreigners coming to the American West, like what their impressions of the West were, but then also how they were consuming Western things through entertainment, right? By these traveling shows from the West that came to Europe. Also, then viewing these Western people and Native Americans who would come through Europe. What can you tell us about how, or what can Western Americans learn by thinking about how foreigners have viewed the region, consumed the region, co-opted ideas, and turned it into popular media? Like, what do we have to learn from how foreigners have played around with who and what we are?
That's a difficult one, but I guess one thing you can at least learn is that European fascination with the American West goes far beyond movies. It predates the movies quite a bit, because in this chapter, which is my favorite chapter of the book, but I realize it's kind of a mixed bag of different things. The chapter is called Imperial Eyes. It has some travel writers starting from the 1800s. Richard Francis Burton, the famous British explorer, was in the American West. He's one of the things I mentioned. Also, these writers like Rudyard Kipling was in the American West. All these world famous people, also several women. Isabel Bird, very famous explorer in her time as well, also took to the Rockies and wrote about it. There was, of course, bison hunters coming from Europe, and these different higher middle class people being intoxicated with the hunting. And some of those European aristocrats, for example, took bison home to England, and they had bisons on their estates in England, which is one of the images that is very absurd, at least to me.
Are there any good historic photographs of bison in the English countryside? Because that would be a great picture.
It would be. And then, of course, there's different types of cultural exchange. Buffalo Bill's Wild West being the one example everybody knows. But what Buffalo Bill was, his show was part of this global phenomenon of human shows, human expositions. What some of the scholars call these days human zoos.
Were Europeans creating these human zoo expositions from other colonial places, from Southeast Asia, Africa? Were they bringing indigenous peoples from there to Europe as well?
People from all over the place. Shortly after the Zulu Wars, for example, in South Africa, I think it was a couple of months after that, the Zulus were dancing in London and in New York, and all those different kind of conflicts brought these different peoples to Europe. One of the one of the prominent people on this was a German impresario called Karl Hagenbeck, who started a world famous zoo outside Hamburg, and the zoo is still there outside Hamburg. He brought in wild exotic animals and wild exotic peoples from the 1870s onward. And he brought, for example, Sami people from Finland, from northern Finland, and also Lakota parties. There was one of the examples I use in the chapter is the early 1900s. Several different peoples rushing to the Lakota reservation to recruit them to all over these different shows across the world. And these were mass entertainment because, for example, the Lakotas in Hagenbeck's zoo in Stellingen outside Hamburg, it was summer of 1912 or something like that. The years are terrible for me. But nevertheless, they drew a crowd of millions of people went to see them. And also those big world fairs had different exotic peoples from all over the world. And it was there was different touring groups within Europe who crossed from Australian Aborigines toward Europe and North America. There were these world tours going on. And some of them actually reached even Finland, which was kind of odd because usually they went to Stockholm or St. Petersburg, but there have been I found a couple of newspaper clippings, old newspaper clippings of these shows in Helsinki, and the whole town goes crazy, basically. Kids are playing cowboys and Indians in every courtyard after that, and people are amazed at these opportunities. And of course, some of those people who tour Europe, this is of course another type of history, not just exploitation, but also these histories of intimacies that some of them stay actually. They just keep the tour group, end up marrying a European woman or man and integrate themselves as Europeans. I've heard some stories of especially in Scotland of these, and one of the things that I'd like to check out later at some point when I have the time.
So many things to check out later.
That's one
right?
of the things with doing this kind of book. It starts with the fascination of these connections, but when you start to kind of dig a bit deeper, not a lot even, but a bit deeper, and record these connections and what kind of scholarship has been done already, you realize that we have only scratched the surface. That there's so much stuff that needs to be known more. That we realize that we are all humans, that we are all connected, that we have all been connected for who knows how long.
It's an important reminder, and I appreciate bringing that to our discussion of the West. The West did not develop in a vacuum; where it's interconnected, and but for many people who study, who are trained in the academy and make this their life study, many of us are, trained. I took coursework on American history, again, very kind of nation state bounded history, which discourages us from thinking transnationally and discourages us from breaking out of this national paradigm. But more practically, to do some of this work, many of us don't have the funding to travel all over the world to all the archives you would need to go to. Many of us don't speak all of the languages that would be required. And so, yeah, there's so many obstacles into doing this work. But yeah, as you say, if you scratch the surface a little bit, I mean, I have, a bunch of files of kind of weird or strange, intriguing stories I found in the archives that are just seem so out of place. And I'm like, there's a big story to be told there, right? And I'm sure that with the kind of work you're doing, at every corner, there's a new file you have to make about, oh my word, there is a global story to be told here that no one's thought about, and that must be exciting for you, but also maddening because there's no way you'll ever get to all of it. Well, you already mentioned that you're working on a book comparing with Germans in South Africa and the American Southwest, and you already talked about that a little bit. What else do you have in the works? And then we probably need to wrap these things up.
That is basically the main thing I'm working on is this title of comparing the American Southwest with the German Southwest Africa. The settler colonial places, focusing on violence and these interracial intimacies, but also these human shows as well. It's kind of connections on these different levels. That's what I'm the main thing I'm supposed to do these days. But of course, there's so many other stuff. One of the things I wrote an article I'm writing an article on is on the Mesa Verde repatriation of the Gustav Nordenskiöld collection, which was, some of those were given back to the Hopi last year, and there's this, and of course that ties to these all sorts of different global issues of colonial legacies, colonial heritages, ongoing colonialism in Europe, repatriation of different looted cultural artifacts, different types of items, and of course it ties to my interest in German colonialism. The Humboldt Forum is about, it's open already, but of course it's open online, but it's about to open in Berlin for real, hopefully once this epidemic goes away. But there's a lot of colonial looted artifacts in Humboldt Forum, and how that story is being displayed, and how Germans are telling their, and making kind of coming to grips with their own colonial history. If one of the things that Germany that fascinates me is how they have been very thorough in their coming to terms with the Holocaust and the World War II issues and legacies. But many scholars claim that colonialism is kind of a amnesia in Germany, and that is what is coming up next. So these kind of different types of connections connected with repatriation and all those issues is some one of the things that fascinates me as well.
Well, I love it. I can't wait to see it all come out, and I hope that travel restrictions and lift soon, so you can get out and do your research,
absolutely.
so that we can meet at a conference somewhere.
Get you to the Maple Leaf and Eagle in Finland.
Yeah, yeah. I need to get myself to Helsinki. That's for sure. Well, thanks so much for spending some time. I was going to say the morning with us, but for you, I believe this is the evening. So thanks for ending your day with us, Janne.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Well, that's it for this month. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll subscribe. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates, leave comments, and communicate with me. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Rudd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream. We have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, fellowships in categories that nearly anyone researching and working on the region from nearly any disciplinary approach or towards nearly any kind of final product can apply. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson, that's Anderson with an O.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. My name is Brendan Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, just about everything else, so you can direct praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books and other studies on the West, borderlands, native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or just about anything else, head to bwrensink.org. That's BWRENSINK.org. Or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, and be kind.